Bishop Robinson, reading your book, honest to God, I get the sensation that, and just for the record, I don't want to accuse you of being an atheist. Obviously you're a Christian clergyman, a Christian preacher, a clergyman in the Anglican Church, a bishop, a high up official in the church. Now, I don't want to call you an atheist or an agnostic, but, reading your book about what you believe about God, I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but you're pretty much saying that God is not a supernatural creature. Not creature. No, I don't mean that. I mean a supernatural being, a supernatural entity who. Because let me just specify that a creature is a being that is created, and God is not a created being. He is a being who creates. He's a being who has not been created, but he is the creator. He's always existed. So, basically, when I read your book, you're basically saying that God is not a supernatural being. You constantly refer to him as the ground of our being. And, the question that I have is, how can God be the ground of our being if he's not a supernatural entity? Well, in order to answer your question, I don't think there's any particular answer that I can give that is satisfactory to you or anyone else. I just know that as we progress throughout time, as we advance in technology and communication, and especially when we learn to let go of our superstitious beliefs based upon scientific discoveries, it becomes quite apparent that there are some things that our ancestors have believed in that we find it very hard to believe in. You mean such things like ghosts and mermaids and vampires and werewolves? Precisely. I understand your point. There was a time in history when people used to think that the earth was flat. And not only that, there was a time when people used to believe that the earth was at the center of the universe. And, there's also a time when people believed that just because people were different, that they were less than human. Like, white people would think that black people were less than human because they were black, and same thing with Native Americans because they were red-skinned, and they practiced life in a way that was different than how they practiced life in England and Ireland and Scotland. So, it's quite understandable that, as time goes on, we learn to adapt to a new way of life and a new way of thinking, especially with our scientific discoveries, and we start to learn that, there's no possible way that these particular creatures could ever exist. There's no evidence to suggest that, fairies exist. There's no evidence to suggest that, ghouls exist and goblins and all that other stuff. But don't you think we take it a step further when it comes to, questioning the existence of God? I've never questioned God's existence. But what I really questioned was, the God that exists, is he the same God that we read about in the scriptures? Is it possible that maybe God is completely different from what the Bible teaches us? And that is something that I think a lot of theologians, especially Paul Tillich and Rudolf Bultmann, have always tried to answer. They've had these questions for a long time, and they try to answer these questions. So, I think it's very hard for us human beings to truly understand God. I think the biggest example of that is basically the Trinity, the doctrine of Trinity. And I know that St. Patrick has always been an advocate for the Trinity, and he was adamant about it, one of the best Trinitarian theologians in the history of the Christian church. But it is hard to understand, how can God be three distinct persons in one God? How can God be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit and still be one God? How can he be three separate persons in one God? I think that's one of the biggest mysteries of the Christian faith that I think a lot of us have always had a hard time trying to understand. Exactly. But I think the thing is that sometimes it's hard for us to explain God. And especially in our technologically advanced civilization, and especially when we learn to put our superstitious beliefs behind us. It is quite difficult, and I understand that. And what I have always tried to do, and I've even mentioned it in my book, I try to be honest to God and honest about God. Honest about what I believed about God. As I had said before, I have never, ever questioned the existence of God or the Christian faith. But basically, the teachings about God and the teachings of the church and how the Christian faith has been expressed over the millenniums. That is what I pretty much questioned. I can understand your point about how it's hard for us to understand God sometimes. You know, sometimes I have my moments where I have a hard time understanding God and his thinking, you know, especially when I read, you know, the law of Moses and the laws that Jesus gave us, you know, the laws of grace and the laws of love in the the Gospels. And, you know, I have a hard time understanding God's thinking, so this is where I do agree with certain theologians such as Bishop John Shelby Spahn. Who's he? I'll tell you about him later. But basically, you know, Bishop Spahn used the analogy that a horse can experience a human being and can walk with a human being and somehow communicate with a human being and be a part of the human being's life, but a human being can never fully understand what it's like to be human. And I think it's the same thing. That's what he said. It's the same thing with us and God. You know, we can learn about God, we can have a relationship with God, but to fully understand God, it's very complicated. And I think that's one of the most difficult tasks that we as Christians have, is trying to understand God. So maybe I shouldn't be so quick to, you know, criticize you about your expression of your Christian faith and how you try and show others, you know, where you stand as far as your Christian faith is concerned. I know that some people may consider me to be a heretic, and maybe rightly so, they have the right to think that I am a heretic, but as I had said before, I'm simply just trying to be honest with myself and simply honest to God. And I appreciate you and your honesty, Bishop. Your luck. Well, I thank you for taking the time to talk with me and express your ideas and your beliefs about God. Your luck. And I'm thankful that you shared your opinions with me too. It's always my pleasure. Thank you. Your luck.